So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Power Saturday. Now it's a virtual event. Last year it was a physical event. I was also there in Paris, and it was really a good event. So hopefully next year it will be again physical in Paris for the Power Saturday. My name, Yannick Borghmans. Let me see if I can switch slides. Yeah, all right. My name, Yannick Borghmans. I'm Office 365 and SharePoint technical lead working at Vendigrade. Doing most of the things in SharePoint Framework nowadays, and of course developing in Azure with Azure Web Apps, functions, and stuff like that, of course. If you want to, you can contact me afterwards in LinkedIn, Twitter, or on my blog website, which still needs to be updated, but I'm working on it. So you can contact me on LinkedIn or Twitter, of course. So what we will see today. First of all, state management in Office 365 or in SharePoint Framework, API management and security, upgrading of your solutions to a newer version and why you have to do it, and some tips and tricks. So this session was built up with my own experiences of having building a larger project in SharePoint Framework. I think we are now developing for the same project more than 2 years already, with at the top of 5 developers at the same time. So pretty a large project in SharePoint Framework, having a lot of difficulties with SharePoint Framework and things how to manage, because yeah, we were coming from more SharePoint on-prem developer perspective, and now moving towards SharePoint Framework, of course, moving towards a more web-based web development approach of developing with SharePoint Framework. So how did we manage to get everything up and running? How do we, for example, get the state management correct in SharePoint Framework and React, of course? We use Redux, but there are also a lot of other possibilities over there with the new React hooks and context API. There's Mobix available. And for smaller projects, it's still the approach of doing out-of-the-box things with React instead of installing a third-party library like Redux, for example. And then, of course, the API management, which is to get connected to external APIs on a secure way. So those topics we will be covering in this session. Hopefully you are enjoying it. So first of all, state management. Hopefully all of you are already using React for developing with SharePoint Framework. So the basics of properties, state, components, and stuff like that, you already are aware of it. So, but top of mind of thinking of React, so the components, so everything is built up from components. You got pretty small components if you want to. You can componentize everything, like I always say to my colleagues. So create small components with specific logic and specific rendering of things. The properties are used to propagate or prop drilling information between multiple components to pass information from a parent component to a child component, and inside of a component you can put things into a state. For example, if you have a form with multiple input fields, text fields for example, each time you type in a character inside of the text field, you can write that information, that's new information, into the state, and everything will be updated inside of that component. React is using the virtual DOM, so it's only updating the DOM. It's only re-rendering things based upon changes inside of the virtual DOM. So everything is pretty fast to update to, so the performance is really good. And it's not only the performance of the application itself, it's also pretty fast to get new things up and running, to get new SharePoint Framework solutions up and running. And it's simple indeed. It's a steep learning curve to get used to developing in SharePoint Framework, and of course to develop in React, especially coming from on-prem development, where we're used to simply write JavaScript code, use jQuery for example to get things done, and of course the server-side code with the dotted part. So now moving towards React was a bit difficult for some people. For example, my colleagues, but also other people I talked about. But once you get after that, once you get past that first week, it's really easy to get things up and running. So different properties and states, so both are used to store data, store information, but properties are read-only. So if you propagate information from a parent to a child, inside the child it's read-only. You can only read the information, you cannot change it, so they cannot be modified. Inside the component, the state can be modified by using this.setState, and changes can be asynchronously. So when calling an API, it can take some time because the API also has to get the information from, for example, an Azure SQL database or somewhere else, or it has to do some specific logic to return the data to. So those things do take time, and the information after a couple of seconds, for example, will return to the application, to the SharePoint Framework application. So things are there or async, and you can update the state asynchronously with the new information. If we look into the data flow in React, so this is basic React, let's say. So from a parent component at the top towards child component, you propagate information with the properties, and inside the component, you use the state. I got a small application demo available just to explain the things of propagating information, how to handle changes of that information, how to store it inside the component with your local state. And I'm also using this diagram and this demo to move towards Redux, where we can have a global application state. So plain React do have a local state inside a component, but with Redux we can have a global application state. It's a small part beside the application itself, or beside the component structure tree, let's say, where we can store information to. So I got my first demo. We got the web part component, let's say, and then we got two different parts: the session list, just for displaying information, and for removing items. So inside of our web part, we are retrieving information from an API. In this case, it's session information. So I put in my API, I think 5 or 6 sessions of today, just the title of the session and the speaker. And this information is then displayed inside of the session list, session item, which is a child component, and then displaying the title, the speaker, and the remove icon. When we click on the remove icon, things will be updated inside of the web part component with the callback functions. Then on the right hand side, we got the input form, where we also have the title, the speaker, and the submit button. And when we submit the input form, that information will also be propagated upwards to the web part component, which will then update the left hand side with the session list. So how do things look inside of this demo? So let me see if I switch to the correct screen. This one. So let me see, this one is still running. Let's close it down. So let's go observe.
No, we are on PowerPoint. I don't know.
Oh, still on PowerPoint? Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. Let me share my screen. Oh, I can see there's already attendees. So
yeah, there is.
All right, so hi everyone. Yeah, at the beginning of the session there weren't any, so if you feel free to ask any questions if you have, and I'll answer them immediately. So can you now see my code?
Yes.
Oh, all right, Visual Studio Code. All right, perfect. So hopefully it's running correctly. So if I go to my local workbench, I can select the SharePoint Framework web part. So normally it's connecting to my API, but do take a while, it seems to be. Oh, Yeah, the API wasn't up and running. So let's see. Come on. Yeah, all right, now working. So we do have here over here the session list itself. So that was the left-hand side of the diagram, and at the bottom we can add new sessions. So my session was Mastering SPFx in larger projects, and my name is Yannick Borghmans. So we can add new information towards the session list itself. So this was the right-hand side, the input form, and the top was the left-hand side of the diagram of the demo. So how do the code look like? So we got our basic component, our web part component, let's say. We got a couple of methods available. So first of all, we're gonna retrieve information. So with the HTTP client, we're gonna call my local host. I got an API running, which will retrieve the information from, and this will be stored inside of my local state of the web part component with the information inside of the session items. The rendering of our application, we can see, of course, the header, and then we got the child component session list and a child component form. With the session list, we will provide the information with the this.state.session item, so the information from the API will pass through, and a delete item, which will be the callback function to delete information at the top level, at the web part component, from the deepest child component, the session item. So inside of the session list, we won't do anything special, let's say. We're just looping over the session items, and we're returning for each session item inside of the list a child component session item. And of course, we are propagating the information, the item. So that's the information of the speaker and the title, of course. And of course, the callback function handle the delete. Inside the child component session item, so that's the deepest part, let's say, just displaying the information from the properties. So propagating information from parent to child was with the properties. Inside the component, we can use the state. So here, just simply displaying information, and on click, we got the X over there. So if we go to the application, if we click on the X, we can delete information. So that's that callback function, which is coming from the deepest child component session item and will be propagated upwards the web part level component, let's say, with the delete item, which will update our local state of the web part level. So clicking here, and then we're going to call the callback function with the properties. From the right-hand side with the form, also pretty easy. Passing through a callback function add item. So we got our local state for the title and for the speaker information, the text field. So like I explained before, use local state for example, forms and for input fields, for example. And the application state, of course, for more complex information. And with the button, when we click on it, simply the add button click, and then use the add item of the web part level method, which will add new information towards the state of the local state of the web part. So if we move towards the session, the slides. So just a small recap, web part level, the information of the session list in the state, and we're propagating the callback function towards the remove icon and propagating the callback function for adding information towards the submit button. So here you can see a bit of the data flow between the multiple components. This was a pretty easy example, and also the data flow was pretty easy. But hopefully you can imagine then when you have a lot of information, a lot of components rendering each other, and then really a difficult information structure, you need a more complex given, like for example Redux, where you have a global application state. So Redux is a state container. It stores all your information in one place. So you can put everything inside of it, but still use the local state. It's recommended. The state is read-only. So when you want to change the state, you need to dispatch an action, and that action needs to be predefined and needs to be of a pure function. So when your component needs to perform a state change, you need to perform that action. You need to dispatch that action, and that will be handled inside of the reducer. So the reducer takes in the previous state, performs that action, and then returns a new state. There are three main principles with Redux. Single source of truth. So the information inside of the store, inside of the Redux store, is the only source of truth there is. The state is read-only, and if you want to change the state, you need to define the pure functions. So, small diagram, without Redux, when a component needs to initiate a change, it's propagating that information with the callback functions towards the other components. With Redux, there's a separate thing, separate store. When the component initiates a change, it will perform that action, dispatch that action towards the store, and the store will update all the other components. So the view, our component do have an action. Let's say add item, delete item. It needs to be predefined, and that action will then be handled inside of the reducer. So the reducer knows what it has to do. So add item, retrieving the information from the action and updating the state with extra information. With the delete, it needs to be filtering out that old information. That will update the store and put in the new information inside of the component, because our component is of course connected to the store, and will then update information. A bit more complex or difficult thing with async calls. So when you need to call, for example, a SharePoint for information or your own external API on Azure, you need to have something like middleware, a dispatcher, which takes in the action. So the initial call, for example, can be an action where we want to have information. So the middleware, the dispatcher, will call the API, wait on the retrieval of information, wait on the API, and then we'll update our reducer and our store. I'm now talking about Redux, which is a very good state library, but there are already other state libraries available, each with their own capabilities and cons and pros, of course. So Redux, Mobix is there also one, Flux, and now I think 2 years ago or last year, React also came up with something on their own, so out of the box, let's say, with React hooks and the context API. But yeah, you have to see which state library you want to use. I now prefer Redux, but I also did some projects with React hooks and the context API. For the demo, how did I change everything from our basic example with React towards an example with Redux? Let's close this one. All right, that will be running. Let's start with the global component. Inside our global component, you can see we don't have any methods anymore available. So the only thing we have is a render method, a render function, which is displaying the header, of course, the session list and the form. As you can see, we're not propagating information from our global component anymore towards the session list and towards the form, and we are also not propagating any callback functions anymore. So inside of a session list, what do we have? Because we need to have some information. You can see here still this.props.session items, so it's basically the same as we previously had with the previous example, but the properties are now filled in with the information from Redux. So we got map state to properties, so map the application state, the global application state, let's say, to the local properties of this component. And what do we have? We got our session items, so we are mapping the state.session items, and the state is the application state, towards the local properties, the local session items. How is everything connected toward the global application state? With this single line, so export default connect. So the connect is something of Redux, connecting map state properties and map dispatch properties. Dispatch will be something I will show you with the session items itself. And we are connecting, of course, the session list. So this class, this this React component will be then connected with these methods. So inside of the session item, we also have this line of code. So the connect of session item towards the global application state. But now this can be deleted if you want to, but now we're not connecting anything of the state to the properties, but we are connecting dispatch to the properties. So we are connecting specific actions, remove session in this example, from the Redux part towards the local properties of this component. So if we then call this.props.remove session, we will perform a dispatch action towards the reducer of Redux, and we will delete that information from our global application state. So what else did changed? Like I said before, we need to define every function up front. So I defined a new index.ts file for all the actions, add new session from a specific action type. So you can choose what you want to, but the most basic thing is iAction, for example, an interface for our actions with the type and the data. So the type can be an enum. So it's more easy to maintain inside of your components which actions you want to use. So we got add session and remove session. Next, to perform those actions, we need to have a reducer. Inside of our reducer, we are performing those actions. So we are retrieving the previous state. So we are cloning the state, and then we are performing the actions with. So we got a large switch, let's say, with the action type. So add session will add new information to the application state, and remove session will remove or filtering out that information. And like I said before, we are retrieving the previous state, performing our action, and then returning the new state, returning the new information, the updated state. Inside our global component, we have something encapsulated, or we are encapsulating our application with the provider. So the provider is also out of the box something of Redux. And we are providing the store. So the store is storing information, let's say. So that's the actual place where the information is stored. And with the reducer, we can update our store. So configuring the store. So we also have to configure everything. So we are creating the store. We are saying which reducer we are using. So the reducer from the file we saw a couple of seconds ago. And we are also applying middleware. So because we are retrieving information from an external API, now it's localhost, but you can easily go to Azure, for example. We need to have something like middleware to perform those async calls. The async calls itself, so from our component, we dispatch the get items action. So get items, which is async, as you can see, retrieving information from the API and then adding information towards the global application state with the reducer. So we're dispatching the add new session function towards the reducer. So if we launch our workbench, normally it's inside of here. Yep, indeed. Here you can see everything is also working now with the Redux, so we can delete information and we can add information if you want to. So everything is working, and we now moved from plain React towards Redux. So next, API management. So we talked about state management, now API management and security. So with SharePoint Framework, everything is client-side, everything is living inside of your browser, let's say, inside of your client browser. And we are using the user context. So like everything with SharePoint and Office 365, if your user doesn't have a permission to a specific page or a document, let's say, you can't see it. So that's the same with SharePoint Framework. We're living inside of the user context. So connecting to a document or retrieving a document which you don't have permission to, you can't with SharePoint Framework. So you don't have anything like delegated permissions like on-prem, which you can do in your C# code. There are no long-running operations possible because, yeah, if you do a long-running operation, you click on the close button of your browser, everything is, yeah, can be broken, of course. If you're writing data towards something, you're closing the connection, yeah, you can, yeah, it's really bad to do. So you also can't do complex or business logic. For example, PDF creation, setting item level permissions, because, yeah, if you have to need some delegated permissions, you cannot do it. And you need something else besides SharePoint Framework. So a pretty good example or usage is the Azure API, Azure Web API, or Azure Function if you want to perform their most complex business logic and the long-running operations, for example. And inside of your SharePoint Framework, you can then wait on it. But if your user doesn't have the time or it's really long-running, minutes, hours, for example, yeah, you can call the API each 5 minutes to check what's the status of the long-running operation. So with Azure, we have Azure Active Directory, of course, and we can secure our API. So we can get everything secure. Not allowed people then cannot connect to the API, and only our SharePoint Framework application can connect to it if you want to. By authenticating against Azure Active Directory, retrieving a token, and then using that token towards the towards our own API in Azure, because it's, yeah, secured then by Azure Active Directory and requiring to first log in with Azure AD. So I got a demo available for that one. So with this demo, I'm connecting my SharePoint Framework towards my own Azure AD secured API, let's say. So inside of Azure, let me see if I open the correct tab. So I got my API here available. So if we go to the URL, so this was already sleeping, I think. If you go to API values, you can see I'm retrieving information, the same information as my local host, but it's now living in Azure. We didn't have any prompt for logging in, but if I go to the same API incognito, so without logging in, I'm immediately getting information that I need to log in to with my user, my Azure AD user, to use this API. So my API is Azure AD secured. How was that configured inside of Azure? So if you, now this is simple Azure Web API. If you go to verification and authorization, can I set this in English? English, yes. All right, authentication authorization. You can see by default this is off, so app service authentication is off. But if you set it on, you get all this authentication providers. So now Azure AD is configured, but those you can also do Microsoft accounts, Facebook, Google, Twitter. If you really want to, you can also add external authentication providers. So if you then configure Azure AD, you get the option of using off Express. So then it's automatically creating everything for you inside of Azure AD, creating an app registration, setting the correct permissions if you want to, and then you are returning a client ID and a client secret. So you can copy it, but I will delete it after the session, so don't worry. And then, of course, the action to take when request is not authenticated. So when I go with the incognito towards the API, what needs to be done? So log in with Azure AD, or of course, the default thing is allow anonymous requests. So no action is required. So yeah, every request is then accepted from Azure part, let's say. So inside of your application, you can do whatever you want to check if the user authenticated or not. But from Azure configuration, then everything is allowed. Yeah, like I said, you can also use the Microsoft account, Facebook, Google, and stuff like that. So these are the settings, let's say, to configure your Azure Web API to have some authentication layer on top of it. Inside of our SharePoint framework, yeah, of course, we need to connect also to the API, and we need to provide some credentials, or we need to authenticate against to. Out of the box, already available in SharePoint framework is the AAD HTTP client factory. This will give you an AAD HTTP client based upon the ID. So this ID is the Azure AD app registration. So when configuring everything, we got the client ID over here. So this client ID needs to be provided over here with the get client. Then if we get the client, the AAD HTTP client, we perform our basic HTTP call towards our API. So just simply get with the configurations v1, and then we're returning that information. So if you go to, normally I have my, let me delete this one, online workbench, so not the local workbench anymore. I'm connecting to the online workbench. Hopefully, yes, indeed. And normally, yeah, indeed, we can see inside of our console, just simply putting everything inside of the console instead of returning some HTML code. We can see inside of this, we are getting information from our API. So meaning that this browser is authenticated with Azure AD for this specific user. So everything was done behind the scenes. So the end user didn't have a prompt to authenticate to. Everything was behind the scenes, out of the box with SharePoint Framework. So it's pretty easy to set up, just a simple clicks, and it's also pretty easy inside of your SharePoint Framework code to get the security up and running, to get everything secured and connected with each other. So really a good thing to use inside, of course, also larger projects to secure everything, let's say. Upgrading with larger projects, meaning that it do take a while between the beginning of the project and of course the end. If there's a end, it can take a couple of years, and within those couple of years, of course, there are new versions available with SharePoint Framework. So like I said before, we started more than 2 years ago with our project, and yeah, that was pretty much the beginning of SharePoint Framework. There were already a couple of versions available, but not, for example, this AAD HTTP client that wasn't available. So we have to do everything by ourselves with ADL, for example, to get everything secured. So those new capabilities we did want to have it inside of our project, so we have to upgrade our SharePoint Framework version of our web part to the newer one. So why? Using the new features, application page connected web part. So of course, a couple of versions ago, we got the capability of connecting multiple web parts with each other. Teams development, of course, React TypeScript. Like I said before, with React hooks that was released by React itself 2 years ago with the new version of React, but SharePoint Framework wasn't really ready to get or to use the new React version. So that was released 1 year ago to get to update towards a new version of React. So that's also a reason to update or upgrade your SharePoint Framework application. How? There's an easy solution for it with the Office 365 CLI. It's a community initiative. You can install it pretty easy with the npm command at pnp Office CLI. Then just simply Office 365 SPFx-project upgrade. And then you can output the information into an MD file with all lines of code which needs to be executed to upgrade your SharePoint Framework solution. Sometimes you have to really check out everything. You need to move to a new file and folder structure, like for example with the version 1.6. If I open the release notes, you can see, over here, you need to provide the TS file, not anymore TSX, for example. The TS-lint file needs to be moved towards the config folder and stuff like that. So you need to be aware of those file changes. So it's not all npm packages that needs to be changed, but also some file changes. So I got an example over here of such a preview report.md file. So first of all the npm packages that needs to be updated. You need to update some files itself, extending new module files, importing from a new location of some properties, let's say. So everything is inside of the MD file, so it's pretty easy to move towards a new version of SPFx. So don't hesitate, just execute the command to get the report, and then of course update all those actions. Normally at the bottom, because this is every line of code with information about it, but normally more at the bottom of the file, everything is consolidated inside of one large command, let's say. So if we execute this information, it was here, sorry. If you execute this script, so the summary is execute this script, and then you're normally, let's say, up and running with the new version. All right, the last part of this session, I got a couple of minutes left, I'd see. Some tips and tricks we got with the larger project. Debug in production. Of course, you got a dev environment, maybe you have a test environment, hopefully, an acceptance environment maybe, and then you got production, but your end user are normally only in the really end users, so not the key users or the testers, only in production. So, but there can be some problems, more user specific, for example, and you want to debug everything. So basically you only have the minified version of your application available, but with this command, so add and load SPFx through debug manifest file, you can load your local workbench, your local code, let's say, towards the production environment. So if you grab the version of your code from DevOps, for example, for Git, you do gulp serve. First of all, gulp clean, gulp serve no browser, and then paste this URL parameters at the end of the URL, and then click on confirm to load debug scripts. You're running your local code inside of the production environment, and you can more easily debug the problems your end users have. With Redux, I explained that you need to create actions. You need to predefine them. So up front, you need to know which actions you have. But yeah, inside a larger project, there can really be a lot of actions available. So please split up those actions, because it gets really dirty after a couple of weeks or months, let's say. Split those up by functionality, user actions, SharePoint lists, more functional splitting up of information, or more location-based information from Azure, information from SharePoint can be a split up line, let's say. Another one is the comments. So if you type in your Visual Studio Code, the slash and the 3 stars, let's say, you get already basic information with the on top of the method you want to comment for. And then when using this method or using this function inside of another file or inside of the same file, you get this pop-up showing that information which was provided inside of the comment. So yeah, developing with a couple of colleagues, not knowing which function does what, you can use this to give some more information towards your colleague about this function. Global components. With our project, we got a lot of global components to provide generic logic. So our details list we encapsulated inside of our own details list, project specific, to get more specific information and functions inside of it, which then can be reused inside of other components. And for example, also we did every text field was a project specific text field, which was then reused because we got the configuration of the visibility of info labels available. So every component can be configured inside of our project with a SharePoint list behind the scenes, a configuration SharePoint list with information of that field, if it needs to be visible, if it needs to have for that specific property to display an info label, for example. But also error handling, required fields, combining of components for the file upload. So just create a file upload component with then multiple child components. Yeah, for example, a list of which files was uploaded with the component to delete everything and stuff like that. But then you can reuse this information, reuse those global components inside of other components. For example, yeah, of course, the buttons, the drop down, the labels, but also the details list and stuff like that. And an extra thing, if you want to take it to an extra level, a better level, you can create a company specific NPM package. So you can reuse those specific components inside of another SharePoint Framework project, instead of just copy pasting lines of code between projects. You can then create a new NPM package. Use PnP.js and PnP controls together with the Office UI Fabric. So yeah, installing just simply the npm command, and then usage. Yeah, with this line of code, you can immediately connect to SharePoint and getting information from a specific SharePoint list, the sessions, and returning that information inside of your SharePoint Framework application. So it's pretty easy to connect to SharePoint with PnP.js. They're doing a lot of things for you, like batching, retrying, and stuff like that, and filtering, which you don't have to do it by yourself, and which you don't have to type in everything by yourself by using the PnP stuff. Like I said, Office UI Fabric for the details list. There's a lot of information and examples already available inside of your Office UI Fabric. And I think it's also calling now Fluent framework. So yeah, they're in between of the transition between those two. But definitely take a look inside of it. It's also using the same components as they are available in SharePoint and in all Office 365. Index files. So if you got a specific folder with a lot of files inside of it, with, for example, the actions, let's say, I created multiple action files, then you can create a single index.ts file and simply exporting every file from inside that folder, so creating a line of code export action.ts for example, and then you only have to provide one single line of code, a single import inside of your component file to import all those actions too. So this creates a more cleaner code, less lines of code inside of your components. To check the manifest, so on the SharePoint page, you can press Control F12 to check the information of which is used inside of your manifest. So I got my Hello World web part here available with the ID of my Hello World web part. And here you can see all those pre-configured entries, all those configurations that are currently running on that application page. The logging application insight. So with SharePoint Framework, you can immediately log towards application insights, but you can create a wrapper, for example, and of course with Redux you can create a middleware to log everything what you want to towards application insights. And a small hint or a tip, the debug level, so verbose information, warnings, errors, for example, the console, put it inside of the property pane. So when there are really issues inside of production, you can immediately edit the page, edit the web part, and change the debug level inside of the property pane, so you get more information inside of your console or inside application insights. And when everything is again working fine as you want to, you can change it back to errors only, for example. Last thing, Visual Studio Code extensions. I use a lot of them. So Visual Studio Code icons to get more pretty folder icons, for example, or React icons. Definitely use that one. Ilios Drive also have a lot of Visual Studio Code extensions, but for example, more specific to SharePoint Framework snippets, which really is useful when creating a new solution to get all files created more easily. Setting sync is to sync information about your Visual Studio Code's sync settings between multiple laptops, for example. Rencard do have an application or do have an extension to deploy your SharePoint Framework solution towards your SharePoint environment from within Visual Studio Code. For myself, I use the One Monokai theme and the bracket pair colorizer. And for Git stuff, I use GitLens and of course the API management from Azure to get more information about my Azure environment and all those APIs. So the key takeaways for this session were: keep using the local state. So you can use a global application state, but for the input forms and stuff like that, keep using the local state to store that information just inside of a single component, instead of using the global application state and using the reducer. Inside of a large project, it's not only for web development or SharePoint Framework development, but do refactor after a couple of weeks or a couple of months. When developing, you're always thinking, oh yeah, that can be better, but I do now have a time pressure. I will do it later on, but we'll always say later on. But do some time planning to say each month we will do two days refactoring, which we wanted to do previously. Then, like I said, the general components, so create more company-wide components, componify everything. So that's the thing of creating small components, and of course keep learning, keep up to date with the new capabilities of React, keep up to date with the new capabilities of SharePoint Framework. So keep learning with all those new capabilities. So that was my session. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup, tout le monde. To join my session. Hopefully you learn a lot of things which you can use inside of your own SharePoint Framework application and own projects. And if you do have some questions, feel free to ask. I didn't saw anything popping up, but you're free to ask any questions if you want to.
Thank you, Yannick, for your session.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Maybe Javel has a question. for you. Adrien? No.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone.